We're turning on the meetings in progress. Okay. Very good. Okay, so today we're going to start learning about how meditation can help us get closer to God through commandments and rituals. Yet again, meditation makes another appearance in our lives, and we will also continue our study of mindfulness and compare it to concentration. And I will say after class for people who have questions. We've covered a lot of ground so far. Just wrapped up blessing power. We're now, as I mentioned, on getting closer to God through commandments and rituals. Upcoming, a really saucy topic, meditation and intimacy between a man and a woman. Rabbi Kaplan has a whole chapter on that one. We will handle that one tactfully, but it's really interesting. Okay, let's dive right in and find out how meditation can help us get closer to God through commandments and rituals. Okay, here's what he has to say. In the previous chapter, which we just discussed about blessings, I discussed how even mundane acts can be made into an act of worship through which one can experience the divine. There are other actions, however, that are specifically designed to bring a person closer to God. These include the many commandments and rituals of Judaism. Very interesting. So on the one hand, as we learned last week, we can turn any mundane act into an act of worship, approach it meditatively, and get closer to God. Obviously, washing the dishes is a universal practice. It's not especially Jewish. So we can turn anything, walking the dog, into a meditation and get closer to God. At the same time, the Jewish way of life has specific things to do that are designed to bring us closer to God. What are they and how does it work? It is taught that the Torah contains a total of 613 commandments. The idea of keeping 613 commandments may seem overwhelming. Indeed, one must be a scholar to even be able to find all 613 commandments in the Torah. However, there are a number of published lists of the commandments, and a study of these lists will show that most of the commandments pertain only to special cases, special people, or special places. Thus, for example, a large number of the commandments deal with the service in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, which no longer exists. And even when it did exist, many of the rituals were the responsibility only of the Kohen priests. Other commandments involve agriculture or criminal law and have little bearing on the day-to-day practice of Judaism. So we're narrowing it down. Not every Jew does 613. Therefore, if one studies the commandments, it turns out that for the most part, the practice of Judaism is defined by 3 or 4 dozen of them. That's what we're dealing with. These commandments define the structure of Judaism, and keeping them is what makes a person an observant Jew. Okay. Very interesting. Okay, how does that work? Besides the commandments found in the Torah itself, there are numerous rituals and customs that have become an integral part of Judaism. A number of these were legislated by the ancient sages because they saw that an additional spiritual aid or dimension was needed by the Jewish people. The additional rituals provided this dimension and allowed the person to have a full spiritual life, even where it was impossible to keep all the commandments. So we have commandments from the Torah and commandments from the sages. Thus, for example, the Torah prescribes that all Jewish holidays be observed for one day. Later, when there was trouble fixing the calendar, it was legislated that festivals be kept for 2 days outside the Holy Land. On the surface, the reason was that there was a question as to which day the festival fell on. The Zohar, Book of Mysticism, however, states that outside the Holy Land, it was impossible to accomplish spiritually in one day what must be accomplished on a festival. Therefore, a second day was added so that one would be able to complete the spiritual growth implied by the festival. So already he's making the point, first of all, that the second day of Yontif is declared by the sages, but there seems to be two reasons for it. One is because at a certain time, way back when, it was hard to determine exactly the calendar. They had trouble identifying when the day ended, when the day fell. So they kind of hedged and said, we got to make this 2 days. And another reason was to compensate for what mystics consider to be a lower level of spirituality outside of Israel. Okay, but the point being that the commandment to keep Yontif is a combination of Torah commandment and from the sages. Okay, the same to a large degree is true of customs. The Talmud states that when the Jewish people adopt a custom, they are doing so on the basis of what is very close to prophetic inspiration. Witnessing the establishment of a custom, Hillel, from the 1st century of the Common Era, before the Common Era, remarked, "Let the Israelites follow their own course. If they are not prophets, then they are apprentice prophets." This suggests that people have the power collectively to fill a spiritual need, to feel a spiritual need and fill it. Therefore, even customs can contain a powerful degree of spiritual energy. So that is like really interesting. So he's basically saying that there's 3 sources of Jewish practice. And well, first of all, he's saying that Jewish spiritual living contains commandments, mitzvot, and practices. The commandments are derived from a combination of understanding Torah and what the sages determine, and why sages and of course the Holy Torah yield activities that are themselves have a certain amount of spiritual energy. And in addition to the commandments, we have customs that also have a spiritual energy that aren't from the Torah, aren't from the sages, but Klal Yisrael, the Jewish community, says, we got to do this. And that itself has spiritual energy. So what's interesting is that in his framework here, from a spiritual point of view, he's saying that the practices that we have that are designed to bring us closer to God are themselves imbued with spiritual energy from the Torah, from the sages, and from the Jewish people. All 3 are sources of spiritual energy. Now, he doesn't give an example, but I would have to say that an example of the custom, for instance, would be the time waiting between eating meat and dairy, which varies across the world. And so what he's basically, like for example, there's the rabbi's name is Shlomo Riskin, who is the chief rabbi of Efrat in Israel. He used to be a rabbi at a shul, famous shul in New York, and he writes about spiritual things, and he has said that, as far as he understands, one reason why, like, some Jews will wait 6 hours between meat and milk, others 3, others 1, is because of the eating habits in different places. People in different places have different schedules for eating meals. Not everybody eats 3 meals a day. So, Like, for example, in the places where they wait only 1 hour between meals, like they must have a series of small meals. Those Jews wait only an hour after eating milk. And other places where people were waiting 6 hours between meals, so those Jews waited 6 hours between meat and milk. So the fact that he's Rabbi Kaplan, using that example, Rabbi Kaplan's kind of saying that, well, for Jews to get together and say, all right, we got to wait between, you had to wait 6 hours between meat and milk, for the purpose of following the mitzvah of not mixing meat and milk, not boiling a kid in its mother's milk. We infuse that waiting period with some spiritual energy because of the intent of Jews in that community to say this should be our practice. That's very interesting. Okay. It was also decreed that before performing many commandments and rituals, a blessing must be said, as discussed earlier, which we discussed in the last component, the last segment. As discussed earlier, every blessing is a statement of God's immanence. However, since a commandment comes from God, it is also an expression of his will. As we have discussed earlier, God is identical with his will, at least on one level of understanding, and therefore God is uniquely present in his commandments. When a person performs a ritual mandated by a commandment, he or she has the opportunity to create a unique bond with God. All right, so interestingly, he's using a certain kind of logic here, which is kind of his forte, which is kind of interesting. He's basically saying, okay, we're commanded to do something, and our practice is to say a blessing before we do that. Am Natilat Yadayim, or whatever, the Hanukkah candles, or everything. You're aware of so many things that we do, and we say a blessing before that. Okay. He says, 2 points. One is when we say, like, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu, our God, the blessing makes us feel close to God, like he's immanent and we can have a connection with him. Okay, so there's a closeness because of the blessing, but because it's a commandment from God, it's an expression of his will. So when we do washing our hands or saying or davening, saying a prayer, we are doing the will of God because that's one of the commandments. But God is not separate from his will. It's not like we're getting close to God's will by saying a prayer. We're actually getting close to God because he and his will are the same. So he's basically saying if you're doing a mitzvah, you're doing God's will, you're connecting to God by doing that because God is the same as his will. God isn't in pieces. It's not like there's God and his will. God has unity, as we discussed in the unity segment. So therefore, to connect to God's will, to do the will of God, is to do God, connect to God. So through the blessing, we become aware of God's immanence. Through doing the mitzvah, we make ourselves aware that we're doing God's will and therefore connecting to God as well. Double barrel connection. When a person performs a ritual mandated by a commandment, he or she has the opportunity to create a unique bond with God. So it should really be emphasized that Rabbi Kaplan is placing an emphasis on the following. One is knowing the blessings to say before you do a commandment, understanding the words of the blessing, understanding the meaning of the words as far as there's a certain philosophical or theological connotation, like to Elokeinu, our God, and at the same time having a certain amount of education or a certain amount of viewpoint where you understand that doing a commandment is not just following the will of God, but connecting to God, because He and His will are the same. He banks on that, and if you can get your brain around those ideas, then you can have an elevated consciousness and a heightened spiritual experience in Jewish life. All the blessings over commandments have a common beginning. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. Blessed are you, O God, our Lord, King of the universe, who sanctified us with precepts and commanded us, and so on and so on and so on. Okay. In the blessing, we state that God sanctified us with His commandments. In this statement, we recognize the commandments as a means through which God sanctifies our lives and raises us above the mundane. We see that the commandments are a special means that God gave us to experience the divine, meaning Him. When keeping any ritual, we should see it as an expression of our desire to be close to God. Here again, love provides a pertinent example. So, in a way, he's saying that the commandments, what we do as Jews, are vehicles, are vehicles through which we pass and connect to God. They allow for transitions so that we can elevate ourselves from this level of consciousness to this level of consciousness. That's what's supposed to happen. And you can see then that you have to have a certain mindset, a certain spiritual sensitivity, a certain training, like the skills that we're developing in meditation, in order to be able to appreciate a mitzvah, a commandment, from that point of view. I'm sure a lot of people do, and I'm sure a lot of people don't. But the work, the spiritual work, should be about that. Treating the performance of a mitzvah as a vehicle to transcend yourself and elevate yourself. And he always gives the example of love. Imagine that you were in love. You were constantly trying to do things to please your beloved and draw closer to him or her. If the beloved makes a request, you may see it as a unique opportunity to express your love. There is no greater pleasure than doing something like that. The very fact that you are doing something that your beloved desires makes it a total act of love. The same is true of God's commandments. These are not acts that one does on one's own to express love for God, but acts that God has asked us to do as an expression of this love. If one keeps God in mind when observing a commandment, the experience can be one of overwhelming love for and closeness to the divine. So, let's again look at this logic. You have somebody, you love that person, and that person says, could you please do X, Y, or Z? Sure, because I love you, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Doing X, Y, and Z brings you closer to that person. So that's his model. So he's saying the same thing. God's basically saying, can you please daven? Can you please learn Torah? Can you please put on tefillin? Can you please X, Y, Z? Can you please not make a false witness? Can you please not murder? Can you please keep Shabbat? Can you please not boil a kid in his mother's milk? Please, please, please. And we do all this stuff, and because we love God, it brings us closer to God. Okay, so the hard part, as we keep discussing, is generating that love of God, because we're used to loving physical things, but he's not physical. So, but there's another kind of love that Rabbi Kaplan points to, the love of doing something. I love doing this. So that's where he's heading. We have to be able to love doing these various mitzvot, and then we get the love frame of mind, and we can appreciate the relationship with God as a love relationship. Furthermore, since these are God's commandments, they are closely and uniquely linked to God's will. This expression of the divine will is every bit as real as the will through which God created the universe. Wow. Therefore, a commandment is every bit as real as a physical object. Really interesting logic once again. If one meditates on this, one can see the observance as something real and palpable, filled with the divine. All right, so this is a good example about, or a good way he's suggesting that we can appreciate his idea of the divine and connecting to it. Like, what he's saying is, everything, as we said last week, everything is an expression of a divine will. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. If he didn't will it, if he pulled the plug out, it's like unplugging your computer. No good. Okay. And his divine will stretches from, boom, the creation of the universe, out of tohu and vohu, out of this nothingness, to saying Kedusha, to keeping Shabbat. These are also expressions of his will. All these mitzvot. So, washing your hands before bread, the whole bit, benching, yontif, kiddush, kaddish. So they too are expressions of his will. So this idea brings the idea of God's of divinity, of God's will, right home, right into our laps. On the one hand, God's will created this unfathomable place of the universe. By the same token, that same will is manifest in davening or lighting Shabbat candles. So he's saying, if you can appreciate, on the one hand, we're appreciating the overwhelmingness of God. By the same token, he's brought himself right into our homes, right into our shuls, right into our living rooms. God is very available. And if we recognize that, it's much easier for us to feel connected. And he's bringing in meditation by saying that one form of meditation, as we know, is to contemplate. Where do we go? One example, of course, is with Ruach HaKodesh, achieving enlightenment. We're talking about transcending the physical through work on yourself, becoming more aware, becoming more humble, becoming more aware of where you stand in the universe. So that form of meditation, understanding who you are with regards to him, type of thing, and his greatness. So we think about that. That's a form of meditation that helps us appreciate that he is manifested the universe, and he manifested the Torah, and he manifests the mitzvot that we're doing today, which we're doing right now. We're learning Torah. When you keep a commandment, try meditating on the fact that God's will is in the commandment. In a deep meditative state, you will actually be able to feel God's will in the action and the fact that God and his will are one. Okay, that's a tough one. Let's get down here. Okay. He's about to go into a very interesting but kind of highfalutin meditation that one would say, in addition to the blessing before a commandment, but we're going to have to spend some time on this because it's really deep. But so to finish this point up, he's again stressing that it is easier for us to understand these complex and sophisticated spiritual ideas if we get ourselves into a meditative state, which is why it's very helpful to do some form of meditation. It could be the kind of meditation we do at the end of class before performing mitzvot, at least before performing extended mitzvot, like with a prayer service. But if you can meditate throughout the day and get yourself into more of a meditative state, then when you do the mitzvah that at a certain time of day, you will better appreciate its spiritual quality, and these ideas about connecting to God will make more sense. You'll feel them. And of course, if the more your day is filled with mitzvot, the more opportunities you'll have to experience this. If you do one mitzvah a day, you can meditate before that one. But if you do 4 and you meditate a little bit before each one, then you got a better chance of understanding this stuff. Okay. Really interesting stuff. And what I really respect about Rabbi Kaplan is that he practiced what he preached, in the sense that he obviously achieved pretty high level of spiritual consciousness. He obviously understands what he's talking about, because he keeps saying you got to do it, you got to do it, you got to do it to understand it. So he knows from whence he speaks. The guy was a meditator. And that's why you'll find that in a lot of other cultures, what's this, you got to experience it to understand it. Okay. We'll continue with that really interesting special prayer that he talked next week. Let's now talk a little bit about mindfulness versus concentration from Bhante. We mentioned last week that mindfulness meditation and mindfulness and concentration, both of which are forms of are acquired through meditation, different meditations, work hand in hand. And mindfulness is an opening, and concentration is a closing and a narrow focus. But that you need the focusing powers, the skills to become mindful. Because as we say, when we do our meditation at the end of class, we're developing mindfulness, but to do that, we have to keep going back to the focal point, back to the focal point, back to the focal. We have to develop our powers of concentration in order to become more mindful. Okay. Concentration could be defined as the faculty of the mind that focuses single-pointedly on one object without interruption. It must be emphasized that true concentration is a wholesome one-pointedness of mind. That is, the state is free from greed, hatred, delusion. Unwholesome one-pointedness is also possible, but it will not lead to liberation. You can be very single-minded in a state of envy or anger, but that gets you nowhere. We've seen that. Somebody, all that's in their mind, they're seeing red. That's a very strong power of concentration. But that gets you nowhere. Uninterrupted focus on something that you hate does not help you at all. In fact, such unwholesome concentration is fairly short-lived, even when it is achieved, especially when it is used to harm others. How long can somebody really stay mad? And you know that when somebody gets mad and they stay mad, they call that feeding that wolf. They're intentionally feeding that state of mind. If they didn't do that, they would wear out. True concentration itself is free from such contaminants. It is a state in which the mind is gathered together and thus gains power and intensity. We might use the analogy of a lens. Parallel waves of sunlight falling on a piece of paper will do no more than warm the surface. But if that same amount of light, when focused through a lens, like a magnifying glass on a paper, falls on a single point, the paper bursts into flames. Concentration is the lens. It produces the burning intensity necessary to see the deeper reaches of the mind. Mindfulness selects the object that the lens will focus on and looks through the lens to see what is there. That's a really good description of the relationship between the two functions. You're mindful, something pops up in your mind, you concentrate on that. And your mindfulness is what's doing the concentration, the concentrating. So again, you're sitting there and you're mindful of the fact, you recognize that you're thinking about a pizza pie. Mindfulness, your powers of concentration focuses on that image of the pizza pie, and it's your mindfulness that is using the power of concentration to look and think about the pizza pie. Mindfulness picked it up. Mindfulness uses the concentration to stay with that picture. It's really interesting. We'll do one more. Concentration should be regarded as a tool. Like any tool, it can be used for good or for ill. A sharp knife can be used to create a beautiful carving or to harm someone. It is all up to the one who uses the knife. Concentration is similar. Properly used, it can assist you toward liberation, but it can also be used in the service of the ego. It can operate in the framework of achievement and competition. You can use concentration to dominate others. You can use it to be selfish. The real problem is that concentration alone will not give you a perspective on yourself. It won't throw light on the basic problems of selfishness and the nature of suffering. It can be used to dig down into deep psychological states, but even then, the forces of egotism won't be understood. Only mindfulness can do that. If mindfulness is not there to look into the lens and see what has been uncovered, then it is all for nothing. Only mindfulness understands. Only mindfulness brings wisdom. Concentration has other limitations too. All right. So on the one hand, he's talking about, as I understand it, the need to develop certain, what we would call midot, certain personality characteristics. And as Rabbi Kaplan taught us, in the work on ourselves, there's actual work to do. If you want to become a kinder person, then you make a kindness plan. You actually do specific things as acts of kindness, and you become a kinder person. There's things we do. Okay. So Bhante kind of goes around that. He's kind of saying that mindfulness, what he's banking on, and what he said is that he believes there's an internal mechanism inside of us that if we get in touch with it, will help us choose to do the right things and not choose to do the wrong things. We will choose to pursue the positive feelings and choose not to pursue the negative feelings. Okay. He doesn't elaborate on that particular mechanism, but I'm reasonably sure that from a Jewish point of view, and what Rabbi Kaplan would say is you got to develop that mechanism. You got to feed that mechanism the right instruction. You've got to know what to do, what mitzvot to perform, type of thing, what personality characteristics you want to achieve in order to be able to make those judgments. Mindfulness, as I understand it, will help you say, oh, wait a minute, I'm leaning a little bit more towards that bad direction. I see I'm heading there. And mindfulness can make you remember, oh yeah, but what I really want to be doing is heading in this direction, doing some good stuff. That really want to be doing is the question. I know from a Jewish point of view, it takes work to develop those midot. That's what we hold. That's what the Ramchal says. It's what Rabbi Kaplan is quoting, the Rambam. So that's how I think these two thought systems complement each other. We got work to do, and we develop that little mechanism that says, yes or no, and mindfulness helps us deploy the mechanism. Okay. I'm sure that's nice and complicated, and we'll keep addressing that. Now, let's meditate. Okay, Margaret,